Thank you to all of you for being the wonderful audience that graces the last session here at this amazing venue. I am very thrilled to be in conversation with Jassa, who is one of the most fun people at this festival and one of the most accomplished. He's been a television presenter. He dropped out of college to do this television presenting and acting, which means that he's going to have a bright career ahead like all dropouts do. And he's now an incredible author of Both Not Half. And this is something that is an important thing to keep reiterating, because when I was trying to describe the last session I was doing to everyone, I kept referring to you as half British, half Punjabi, and I had to keep reminding myself, Both Not Half, it's literally in the book title, right?
Yeah.
And in many ways, that is the question of identity that you face. Why Both Not Half?
Why Both Not Half? So Both Not Half was, the realization came in a moment of sort of blinding clarity in 2019, when frustrated at the lack of opportunities I had as an actor to explore my Punjabiness as on TV and in film, I turned to social media inspired by the likes of Just Rain and Guz Khan, and I recorded a video of myself speaking Punjabi, pretending to be like a Tayaji character, berating me in Punjabi. I was like, he was like, "Tu ki bana raha?" I was like, "Oh, I'm making some dal. Vich ki pauna?" I was like, "Oh, loon, lasan, gande, masala." And then I put in some other ingredients, and he was like, "Eh, goneyan da kam ki hai?" And so that became like the sketch. And then people were really confused by it, and somebody had commented and tagged their friend, saying, "This guy speaks better Punjabi than us. And he's only half." And when I saw the words "only half," I realized, the realization came that I'm not half anything. The video clearly demonstrated that I am both. And so I responded with the hashtag Both Not Half. And after that, the world just started to look very, very different.
That's incredible. And I think the fun part about the book is that it describes a growing up that is incredibly relatable, right? This Both Not Half experience is one that I think several of us share. I want to start off by asking you about Kipling. You talk about Kipling, you talk about reading Kipling growing up, and the challenges that come with it. And I read Kipling growing up, and then I was like, oh dear, white man's burden.
Yeah.
And very often you're taught to say, discard Kipling, like I was such a terrible human being for reading Kipling. But you make it a little more complex. You say, what does it mean to read Kipling?
Yeah, well, also, once I discovered that Edward Said had also said you cannot simply dismiss Kipling, I was like, okay, it's fine. I've got permission. I found it really confusing. Firstly, I just want to say I turned to Kipling out of ignorance, because had I really understood, and perhaps maybe had I spent more time in India as an adult before now, I would have understood that my experience is universal. And I got asked in an interview yesterday, what's the difference been between the reception to the book in the UK and in India? And there is no difference. And I only realized that in the interview, and I found that really quite emotional, because it was that realization that actually I always sort of intuited that this was a universal experience, this sense that we are whole and multiple beings that are forced to interact with a world that wants to fracture us and make us fractions and put us into boxes and say you have to be either this or that. You can't sort of straddle them. The fluidity is not really allowed. But because I didn't know that and I didn't understand that, I was looking to the past for sort of historical antecedents, I guess, that could explain my being, that perhaps these characters might understand who I am. And, I'd grown up watching The Jungle Book. I felt very connected to Mowgli. When I used to come to India as a kid, I would pack like my red underpants and sort of reenact the Disney film in the monsoon rain. So I had this immense affinity because, I didn't understand as a child that what I was watching was the story of a young boy caught between two worlds trying to find his place within adulthood. Nor did I understand that Kipling's conclusion is that Mowgli must leave the jungle and must join the man village and must choose to become, a man, a sahib, over, being at one with the jungle. And the same was true of Kim. I turned to Kim, and because Kim's much more of a, I guess it's more of a traditional narrative. There's not sort of talking animals or anything. I was amazed to find myself having this incredibly strong emotional response to what is, an overtly colonial text, because, the story takes place. It's the story of a young white boy growing up on the streets of Punjab, interacting in the same way that I used to play cricket in the gully and had like affectionate banter with my uncles. And so I found it really, there's a bit towards the end of Kim where he's gone on his adventure and he's really tired, and he says he wakes after sleep that soaks like rain after drought, and he felt his being lock up anew on the world with an almost audible click. And I was really crying when I was reading it, because I was like, wow, Kim's found this. He's found his place in the world. He's found what I'm looking for. And then I realized that what he's realized is that his place is to become a sahib, to become an agent of empire, and to be, choose white over brown. And that was so frustrating, because I didn't want to choose white over brown. I desperately wanted to read Kipling as this sort of proponent of the hybridity. And I realized that was sort of unfounded. I was sort of trying to create something. And then I realized, that celebration was something that actually I needed to create. And so I stopped looking to the past. I stopped trying to live within nostalgia, and I started looking to the future and being like, right, what future can I forge? What story can I tell?
And that's also why I love the book, right? Because it's candid. It's not, look at poor little me, I'm not fitting in, this is the sympathy I want. This is a very serious look at these things. You say, I read Kipling, I like Kipling, now I have to deal with liking Kipling.
Yeah.
This is...
That was the one bit my publisher had a real issue with. They were like, ooh, could we maybe tone down the love?
But I love that you don't tone it down. And I like the fact that it's honestly in a moment where we're being taught to sort of shove that privilege, all those misunderstandings, or honestly those experiences under the carpet, you deal with them head on, including with privilege, right?
Yes,
this is a book where you acknowledge that there is obviously a sense of not fitting in, but there also is a sense of privilege. How do you balance that? How do you prevent this from becoming a sort of linear narrative that, oh, this is the experience that I had, and it's very sad?
I guess I realized that I'm a storyteller, and that came from, I for a long time thought I was writing an academic book about identity. I realized nobody would read an academic book about identity written by me, because I'm not like the many professors and esteemed academics who have been at this festival. But I am a storyteller, and that realization came from, after my TED Talk, while I was trying to write the book, conversations with my sister, who's here in the audience today, and my mum and my flatmate who actually turned around and said to me, I think this book a bit of a vanity project. And that stung, but there was some truth in it, and I reflected, and I was like, okay, actually what I need to do is reapproach this. I'm a storyteller, I'll tell a story. And I've forgotten what that first bit of the question was. What were you saying? This was going somewhere.
No,
the end of the day.
This is precisely it. I think the relooking of it not as a vanity project is important, because the book isn't sort of a vanity project. It isn't saying that you're such a great guy and we should all love you, but you're examining your own story and saying it's showcasing so many difficult questions that we have to ask that are not just personal, but also deeply political. But I want to stick to the personal narrative for a bit, because I think while there is an acknowledgement of the privilege, there's also an understanding...
Sorry, just the privilege, that was what you were saying.
Yes,
so what was interesting was that I realized that the reason I had my identity crisis, if you want to call it that, in my early 20s was because I was insulated by my whiteness, because I wasn't experiencing the kind of friction that, say, my sister was experiencing, or my brown contemporaries. I was also growing up in Leicester, which is a very mixed heritage city, but in terms of dealing with that, the balance of privilege and wanting to talk about my experiences, I think that came from... I spoke to people within my union. I was elected to the Race Equality Committee of my union, Equity, for actors, performers, and stage managers. And I realized at those meetings that I did have a right to speak, absolutely, as do we all, but I also, and we all have a duty to listen. And I think that was the thing, that when I was doing the research, having conversations, speaking to people, I was listening to what they were saying, and I was open to having my mind changed and having to confront uncomfortable truths. And I think that's why it's very kind of you to comment on the sort of the honesty. And I realized that that was necessary. If I'm trying to change somebody's mind who's reading it, who maybe has preconceptions, I need to demonstrate that I too didn't always have, the correct answer.
And to me, there's a certain queer reading to that experience, right? Because in a way, queerness operates in that sense. As a child, your sexuality isn't in question, but as you grow older and your sexuality becomes a point of contention, that's when you really grapple with that question of your identity and have that crisis a little later on. And the part that struck me most, and I've quoted it because I wrote it down, is a sentence where you say you're considered to be your parents' lover before you are seen as their child. And the experience of that, right? And I think, alongside that privilege is this very real experience of not being part of something that's mainstream, even in a multiracial Britain, where you would have experienced this or imagined that this experience would be far more common than it is today.
Yes, yeah, and it was amazing. It's surprising, really, like how that thing of being mistaken to be a parent's lover is quite common. That's an experience that keeps popping up when I'm speaking to people, and how incredibly embarrassing and cringeworthy it is to be in a situation where you're having to, explain why you're with your parent or why you're showing affection, and it just comes from ignorance, and also not just ignorance, perhaps, but from this. I think there's a reason it was my acting work that led me to this. There's a lack of representation. There is a total lack of representation when it comes to mixed people, mixed stories. The term mixed race was used and has been used in the UK in casting for a while to just be sort of a shorthand for white and black mixes. So essentially, mixed race had become equivalent of light-skinned black. So mixed never looked like me. Yeah. And I think that's the thing. I did work, again, through Equity, my union, to change the database system and the way in which the search criteria works on the main casting database in the UK, to allow for true multiplicity, to be able to be on the system. So casting directors can search very specifically. Providing the tools is one thing, whether that results in representation is another, but this is part of the activist streak that runs through. It's the radical bit of the subtitle of the book, is about taking the idea of both not half, discovering that, and that's not the end. That is the middle, and it's then how does that then change my outlook on the world? How does it change how I see the world, and how can I change the world in order to make it a world of boths and not a world of halves?
And it's such a treat to listen to you in person. We haven't had a single conversation about the book before because I refuse to give anyone questions before, because I think it makes the conversation very staged. Because just as he is moving so effortlessly beyond and between the personal and the political is exactly how the book operates, right? And you almost blend those worlds seamlessly, because the personal narrative and this experience of being mistaken for your parents' lover is conflated with a lack of representation and sort of connected to each other. And you're talking about race in Britain, and you're talking about these big, weighty issues that are not taking the form of a boring social sciences book. Sorry to anyone who's written one over here. But
I mean, I read a lot of social sciences to write the book, so I'm very grateful for those
clearly you've read your Saeed.
Yeah.
So, but you're doing this in a way that's so powerful, because it's treating what is bridging the lines between memoir and a sort of exhortation to a political project of care and of considering these differences. What made you choose that form? Are you seeing more writing like this emerge?
I suppose, like Akala's book, Natives, was a strong inspiration. But also it was the nature of my TED Talk. Again, I spoke to my sister, who's here in the front row, about when I was struggling with putting the pitch together, and she kindly reminded me is that the TED Talk was successful. You just got to do like an 80,000 word TED Talk basically, and you're allowed to go into much more detail. And I was like, yeah, that's true. And so the way it sort of came about was because I focused on telling a story. And whenever the story required some history or some facts or some research, then it came in. And as soon as that story beat was done and it moved us on to the next thing, I then moved on. So it's kind of a weird alchemy because I didn't realize quite what it would result in once it was all put together. Because actually approaching it now as a finished product, I'm like, how on earth did I figure out to do that there and do that? You know, structurally, initially when I put the structure together, it was very, very thematically divided. But because of that narrative arc, it meant that I was able to sort of weave. There's a sort of chronology to the first 4 chapters, but once you've established the journey of who I am, in the second half of the book, you can then, it allows for slightly more moving back and forth through time but you don't lose the narrative arc. It's almost a bit like a movie where you're sort of then cutting back and forth in time, but the story is such that it still makes sense and it has this propulsive forward momentum, and it has a conclusion. It has an ending. It's not the ending of my ongoing story. Being here in front of all of you guys is just magical. I can't even put it into words, to be honest. This is part of the ongoing story, but I knew that I wanted the book to have a satisfying conclusion, which I think and I hope it does.
It does, and I think what's really interesting, because you mentioned the form of the book, is the narrative arc of this book in some ways follows the narrative arc of your Instagram. And yes, I scrolled way back.
Wow.
Because you're really funny and you do not take yourself seriously. And now I think what's exciting to watch is at the same time, you're still funny, you're still not taking yourself seriously, but you're also talking about very serious things. How do you juggle that? And do you think writing a book makes you have to choose one or the other, or can you do both?
I think, well, yeah, I'm always an advocate for both. I think it's because I feel like people listen. So it's funny, I've got one of my union comrades who always says, if another activist, well, there's one particular activist who's like, if Dan says something, people always put up their guard and they're like, oh, you're a super radical, sort of crazed militant. And then somehow, if I say it, people are like, oh yeah, maybe that makes sense. I don't know. It's something that I've just found. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's something I've discovered through therapy. Is actually that because of my ability to move between different worlds, I've always found a way to, I guess, ingratiate myself. It sort of comes from a sort of like a survival mechanism, I think. And I'm now, I guess, a bit more conscious of when I'm doing that. I mean, it can be quite, I don't know what's the word, debilitating if I'm not conscious of doing it, because I'm suddenly, I'm not able to hold and be my full self all the time. But now I'm aware of how to use it as a bit of a superpower. So I don't know. Also, I just think serious things are also funny things. I think life is that mix of, dukh, sukh, and ultimately the Santok. So I try to stay within the Santok mindset.
On that note, for someone who is simultaneously hilarious yet incredibly potent, can we have a huge round of applause for Jassa? And I really wish we had more time, and this was not a 30-minute session, but I want to have some time for us to ask all the burning questions that we have for you. So anyone in the audience who has a question, can you please raise your hands? And yes, at the front there, can we get a mic there? If you could keep it brief, because I know we only have 4 minutes.
I'm just curious, why is it, first of all, hello and good evening, and thank you for a great talk. I'm Mukti from Indore. Why is it so important for human beings to search identity, and why our identity is invariably linked to our existence?
So why is identity linked to the importance of identity?
In general, for
Maybe I
human
want you to
beings,
talk
why do you
about the
think?
hospital.
Sorry?
Maybe you want to talk about the hospital here.
Yes, yeah. So I think I understand your impulse, but I think there's something that I think there are 2 epigraphs to my book. One by Guru Nanak Dev Ji and another by Bulleh Shah. The Guru Nanak one is Apna Mool Pachan, recognize your origin. And the Bulleh Shah quote is Par par ilm te fazil hoyo, vikade apne aap nu padhya nahi. And I think even this is a book about my self-discovery. I think ultimately the journey towards understanding the self is to sort of recognizing the self in others. And I think it is the journey towards a very sort of radical empathy that comes. I think we get stuck, our society is stuck at the self-identity bit. And I think the journey of this book, and I think what will be informing whatever I do next, comes from the very radical sense of empathy that I've developed on this process. I no longer think of myself as supporting or being an ally to other fights, say the fight for queer liberation. That is now my fight.
Another question, the gentleman in the front.
Good evening. So my question comes from your answer. You said, "Apna mool pechan." So the first line is, "Man tu jyot saroop hai." So it's about the spiritual achievement of an individual who thinks that the entire world is the reality, but the reality is beyond the world. So is there any efforts, or is there any journey, or is there any remarkable achievement on that path of understanding the mool as the part of the greater being?
Absolutely, yes. That is, I realized when I got, so the final chapter of the book is called One, Not Both. And my understanding that I came to that both, not half, was really my attempt or an expression of ik. And I realized that I didn't have enough space in that final chapter to really dive all the way into that. That's really probably going to be what inspires whatever I write next. But that's the journey I'm on now, is realizing I have a strong, centered sense of self, but I'm now starting to understand, exactly as you say, "Man tu jyot saroop hai." I'm starting to see and find myself seeing that jyot everywhere and in everything. And, after this talk, I'm going to sign some books, and then my sister and we're grabbing a train, and we're going up to Amritsar this evening. We'll arrive there tomorrow morning, and we're heading to Harmandir Sahib, so I'll be... I'm going there with that in my heart, and to give thanks for that, so thank you.
On that note, everyone, I'm very sorry I have completely run out of time, and I really request you to get the book, meet him while he signs the book, and get that message. We've really gotten a very stern reply for One Not Both. And once again, a loud round of applause for Jassa.
Thank you all so much,
As
and a huge
moving
thanks
as
to
he is
JLF.
brilliant. Thank
It's
you
been
so
amazing.
much. And I really wish we had more time with each other.
I really wish we had more time too.